Evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. I thought that I would do this video today overall because not only do I think that I needed to do yet again another video on Mr. Jermell Charlo, but the reason why I thought that this video would be so important and so particularly special is because I do think that it is important to note the difference between someone overall who actually gives fair overall criticism and someone overall who actually gives out fair judgments, and the difference between that of an actual hater. Because unfortunately, I don't think that most people truly know the difference within that of the sports world. And of course, because the sports world, it is great entertainment value, and because so many people, since they're never usually going to get on that type of a level of a Manny Pacquiao or a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or a Canelo Alvarez, or basically, what am I saying? Basically, a world class level athlete who can claim that they were either the best of their generation or the best at what they do in a particular field, or on top of that, when it comes down to who is also widely world known. Not many of us overall are going to have overall that pleasure. It just is what it is. So many people overall, I believe, somewhat latch themselves onto their favorite athlete. And overall, of course, that does cause a stir of emotions. And if you say something that overall a certain amount of people may disagree with, they may call you a quote unquote hater, even if the criticism does seem somewhat fair. But there is a difference, in my opinion, between someone of fair and just and overall realistic and objective criticism and someone who is a quote unquote hater or someone who is very, very highly delusional. When we talk about overall, if we were to just have examples of conversations, and this may be a little bit of a longer video, maybe anywhere from 35 to 40 minutes, even because I do want to get all my points across. The boxing top 10 pound per pound list, and if we talk about certain things being subjective, the boxing pound per pound list, but not only but the boxing pound per pound list, but many of the top 10 lists throughout all of sports. If you were to put a top 10 list overall throughout each and every individual sport about who you think the top 10 athletes are for each and every sport, it is going to be a little bit mixed. And you're going to have a certain amount of people, all in all, that actually might be able to make some very, very decent points as to why they have those guys there. But the thing overall, if you are an objective and logical commentator, there really is no problem with certain disagreements. Even certain of my commentators or certain of you that may watch my channel here and there, you may even disagree with me, or I may disagree with you here and there. There really is not a problem with that. But at the end of the day, what people do need to look out for is people putting the same standards on certain athletes overall. That is what a logical and objective commentator does. And on top of that, the difference between someone who is actually giving fair criticism and an actual hater is that the fair criticizer will actually have one to several points to why he thinks the way that he does, and they actually will make logical sense. Usually, when the hater talks, when it comes down to it, their points usually don't make any logical sense, or at least very little logical sense when it comes down to it. They don't usually hold the same standards overall for other athletes as they would that athlete because they just want to see them go down and out. So that's how you can tell, all in all, a difference between a hater and someone, all in all, overall, who is actually giving fair judgment. When I review some of these channels like that of a Dante's Boxing Nation, and when I review an Aki TV or overall a Boxing Ego, and you have some of these guys that apparently say that Canelo Alvarez is allegedly avoiding Jermell Charlo, or some of these other fighters out there. And then when Canelo Alvarez is about to face Jermell Charlo, and Jermell Charlo is no older, I believe, than 33 years old at the current moment in time. I don't even think that he's that old. And then all of a sudden, when that fight was allegedly about to happen, they don't keep the same energy. And all of a sudden, they say, well, he's fighting Jermell Charlo now that he looks weak. That is what a real, actual hater is. That is an example of hating. But if you have someone overall like with Jermell Charlo, for example, and I think overall the exact same way about Jermell Charlo as some other people do about him, which is that I believe that he is a very good fighter, maybe even a decently great fighter if you want to put him there. And when I say decently great, to me there's different levels of greatness. And I already, told this to one of my commentators the other day. Out of a, if I were to rate Jermell Charlo's career out of a, a scale of 1 to 10, one being the worst, and 10 being, let's say a Floyd Mayweather or a Manny Pacquiao, I would maybe give Jermell Charlo at the highest a 6. And some people overall, they would not agree with that. But Jermell Charlo, in my opinion, he just does not have the greatest of resumes. But the main question is about Mr. Jermell Charlo is, does he 100% truly deserve to be on the top 10 pound for pound list. And in my view, you certainly could debate him there. I really don't have a problem with it, but it is very debatable because right now I think that the pound for pound list, that it is very, very competitive. It's extraordinarily competitive. I think that I have 5 fighters who are pretty much locked on my top 5 pound for pound list, whichever place that you put them. In my opinion, this is just my view. You pretty much have to have these 5 fighters within your top 10 pound per pound overall for me to take your list seriously. You have to have Terrence Bud Crawford there. You have to have Errol Spence Jr. there. You have to have Alexander Usyk there. You have to have, in my view, and not everyone is going to agree with this, Tyson Fury there. And a certain amount of people can disagree with that. It just is what it is. If you were to not have him on your list because he's a heavyweight, I understand. But at the end of the day, I do have to put him on my list. And I'll explain why here in a minute. And also the other fighter that I believe that you have to have on your top 10 pound per pound list is Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. And even that, because of his last loss, if you were to not have him there, I would understand why. But those are 5 fighters, in my opinion. At least 3 out of those 5 fighters that I just mentioned, for me to really take your list seriously, I better see at least 3 out of 5 of those fighters on your pound per pound list. If you really are, in my opinion, a list that really knows what you're talking about, you're probably going to have all those fighters there. Now, when it comes to Mr. Jermell Charlo, can I really debate that Jermell Charlo is on the level of any of those guys? In my opinion, no. Why is that? Because when it comes down to it, Mr. Jermell Charlo, if I were to just compare him to that of a Terrence Bud Crawford, now maybe you could debate if you truly wanted to that the Brian Castano win is a better win than any of the wins in Terrence Crawford's career, if you wanted to, but I would at least somewhat compare it to that of the Sean Porter win, because Sean Porter has proven himself to be at least an A- fighter, in my view, within his career. And Terrence Crawford, he was the only one to stop Sean Porter to this day when he still was at least somewhat at the best point in his career. If we were to compare him to Errol Spence, I don't think that I could, put him over Errol Spence. Sure, Errol Spence has only worked within one weight division, and he's never been undisputed. But if you take a look at his resume and his skill set, I don't think that there's any debate that Errol Spence is probably over Jermell Charlo. If we were to talk about Alexander Usyk, I don't really think that there's any debate about that because Usyk not only is undefeated and never lost to a C-grade fighter the way that Jermell Charlo did in Tony Harrison, but on top of that, he probably is more skilled for his divisions. And on top of that, he not only completely unified a semi-talented division, I would at least give the division maybe an A- when Usyk was able to dominate the cruiserweight division when that division was ripe with a bunch of undefeated fighters such as Maris Bradis and Michael Hunter and a certain amount of those other guys. And then he went up to the heavyweight division and he defeated probably at the time at least the second best heavyweight in the world in Anthony Joshua. And he not only was able to beat him, he was able to absolutely embarrass him. So Alexander Usyk, he doesn't even, I believe, have 20-some fights on his resume. Or if he does, it's just over 20 fights. And he's been able to accomplish all that. Canelo Alvarez, his resume speaks for itself. Yes, he did lose in the last fight. I scored it personally 8 rounds to 4. But at the end of the day, Canelo, with what he has and the belts that he still has, in my view, he probably would be at the number 5 spot. And if we were to talk about Tyson Fury, this is the one that most people start to lose me on, or, I start to lose some people on, because some people commentate, well, how can you have a heavyweight on the pound for pound list? Because heavyweights are not meant to be on the pound for pound list. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. Now, it is hard just for me to put a heavyweight at the number 1 pound for pound spot because they can't really transfer in other weight divisions. But at the end of the day, the heavyweight division right now is at least decently semi-talented. If I were to give it a grade from A+ to A-, I would at least give it an A. You could potentially even give it an A+, at least for the division. Now, the Vladimir Klitschko era, in my opinion, that was not a very talented era. But this is the era not only of Tyson Fury, but of Deontay Wilder, who pretty much is this generation's George Foreman, at least debatably. Overall, you have Anthony Joshua, you have Dillian White, you have Andy Ruiz, Luis Ortiz, and you have many, many good up-and-coming fighters that are going to be on the come-up. So at the end of the day, Tyson Fury was not only able to embarrass Vladimir Klitschko, who was at the time looked at as top 5 pound for pound in the world, he was also able to embarrass Deontay Wilder on 3 separate occasions. I believe that he's been able to win every single belt of this division within the past 10 plus years. He clearly is the best and most skilled heavyweight of the past 10 plus years. And on top of that, he has an A-grade resume. He is extraordinarily skilled for his size when it comes down to it. And he's undefeated. I don't really even think it's a debate. Tyson Fury is not only within my top 10 pound per pound, he is within my top 5, no doubt about it. It just is what it is. Now that brings us overall to Mr. Jermell Charlo in the bottom 5 of the top 10 pound-for-pound list. Who do I have there? Because for you to be high in my pound-for-pound list, you have to have at least debatably one A-grade win in your career, one very definitive A-grade win in your career. And most of those fighters that I just mentioned probably have a multitude of A-grade wins, at least debatably. So if we were to talk about Mr. Jermell Charlo, I believe that the Brian Gastano win was a very decent A-grade win, but is that really a fighter that, in my opinion, would definitively be A+? I don't know if I would rank him A+, but I do give Jermell Charlo a hell of a lot of credit for beating Brian Gastano. The problem is that I just don't see any of the other fighters, in my opinion, that he beat really as A-grade fighters. Hell, you can even debate that some of them were not B-grade fighters. I'm sorry, but when I really take a look at Jermell Charlo's resume, besides Brian Gastano, which is a great win, I will give you that, but other than that, is Erickson Lubin really someone that I take a look at that is A-grade overall? Is, Mr. Jason Rosario, is he really someone that I take a look who's A-grade? Is Mr. Overall Tony Harrison someone who was knocked out in every championship caliber fight before he fought and beat Jermell Charlo in the first fight, a fight that he was not supposed to lose because he was at the best and most experienced point in his career? So you're telling me that Jermell Charlo, apparently according to these guys, is definitively top 5 pound for pound? No, I'm sorry, I just don't see that. It just is what it is. And then you have the bottom 5. Now, Jermell Charlo, in my opinion, could debatably be there, but even that is a legitimate debate because you're talking about other fighters that have better definitive wins or possibly better definitive wins or have looked more dominant or possibly could be undefeated. Certain fighters, maybe like a Naoya Inoue, if you wanted to debate that. Now, I would not say that he has a better resume, but if you also are one of the guys that has Terrence Bud Crawford high on your list, one could debate that Naoya Inoue has looked like the most dominant fighter within the past several years. Now, he does not have a win in his career like that of a Sean Porter, but if you're one of the guys before the Sean Porter win to put Terrence Crawford within your top 5 pound for pound, Naoya Inoue should at least grace the list, in my opinion. If we're talking about Josh Taylor, maybe because I personally thought that he lost his last fight, maybe you could get him off if you wanted to. But at the end of the day, Josh Taylor still does have some very decent wins. He beat Victor Postol when he had a little bit of goodness left in his career. He was able to beat Jose Ramirez and Regis Prograis when they were undefeated champions. And also he was able to defeat a couple of other decent contenders. So the real question also would be, would Jermell Charlo really beat that of Josh Taylor? I'm not really sure. In my opinion, that's kind of a coin toss. If we were to talk about overall, Jermell Charlo versus that of a Devin Haney, would I have, Jermell Charlo over Devin Haney? I'm not so quite sure about that. Because Devin Haney not only is undefeated when it comes down to it, but on top of that, I believe that he's more skilled. He just recently became undisputed, and he's looked more dominant. And you can argue, in my opinion, that George Kambosos and Brian Gastano, well, I would say that Brian Gastano, in my opinion, was more skilled, all in all, than what a George Kambosos was. But Devin Haney, you could debate over him. And then, of course, you have Shakur Stevenson, Dimitri Bivol, certain guys that you can argue just got big wins in their career. So this narrative that Jermell Charlo just absolutely has to be within your top 5 pound for pound, no, I'm sorry, I'm not falling for it. It just is what it is. Now, are there certain lists out there that maybe don't have certain fighters on the list because they want certain other fighters on the list and maybe it's possibly racially motivated? You can certainly argue that. But once again, one has to really know the difference between a hater and someone on the know that is actually bringing up logical, critical points. But anyways, we're going to see what Mr. Boxing Ego has to say. Let's get into it.
Hold up. Jermell Charlo's that boy. We're going to talk about why in this video. What up, Fight World? It's your boy, Ego, and I'm back with some more boxing. So reports are suggesting that Jermell Charlo will face his mandatory Tim Tszyu. Now, this hasn't been actually confirmed to my knowledge.
Tim Tszyu, who in my opinion is also not an A-grade fighter. It's very interesting that these channels, like that of Dante's Boxing Nation and Boxing Ego, they allege all in all that Canelo apparently fights in a weak division, or Alexander Usyk allegedly fought in a very weak division. But then Jermell Charlo apparently fights in one of the most stacked divisions in all of boxing. Like, what are you talking about? It's no offense against Jermell Charlo, but Erickson Lubin is never going to be an A-grade fighter. He never was from the get-go, and he's never going to be. It just is what it is. There is no fighter there other than Brian Gastano when he was undefeated that truly was going to be able to challenge Jermell Charlo, or at least should have. Because we all know that he ended up losing to the C-grade fighter in Tony Harrison. But anyway.
Recording this video, and they're saying the fight is going to happen in January 2023. Now, based on the reports, this sounds very likely. Like, I can understand it, because especially if they're pushing it that far out, he's a mandatory anyway, and he's been saying that he wants his opportunity, his shot. So I could see this fight happening. Now I got to keep it a buck like a dollar store. Jermell Charlo is that boy, and there's nothing that...
Well, he's that boy at 154 pounds. And don't get me wrong, once again, the Brian Gastano win was a very great win. And, someone commented on my video the last time, I believe I talked about Jermell Charlo. Someone said, all in all, well, it's not really his fault that the type of competition is there, that's there. And listen, I'm not getting after Jermell Charlo. This is not a Jermell Charlo hating video. But if we were to talk about debatably who is on the top 10 pound per pound list, if we're having a debate, and this is what it is, then we do need to talk about his resume. Okay, and if you do not have even a debatable A- resume, which I would say now maybe he does, just because all in all, the Brian Gastano win, but all the other wins, in my opinion, in his career are B or C grade wins. It just is what it is.
Prompted me to make this video, but on my channel, this is one thing that I specialize in. And, I'll talk about what I want to talk about. I don't have to talk about what's popular or what other people are talking about, but I want to shed light on Jermell Charlo, because what he's doing is that of a warrior. What he's doing is that of a high-level pugilist, and I respect it. So on my channel, I told you there's a lot of people in boxing, from Instagrams to YouTubes to whoever, reporters, deadline reporters, and the bottom line is, they'll talk about boxing, the negative sides of boxing. It's like Vice Sports, the dark side of boxing. They'll tell you that all day, and all the things they're angry with and all the things that aren't right. And there are some things.
Well, that sounds a lot like you, because you spend, at least from what I know, 90% of the time complaining. It is what it is, especially when one of your boys, one of your fighters that you like is not ranked in the way that you like. And don't get me wrong. Once again, are there certain fighters, maybe black fighters overall, that are ranked in a certain way, or maybe not put on the top 10 pound per pound list because maybe they don't want certain black fighters on their list? And you can debate that, but you have to have logical evidence. And just to say, overall that Jermell Charlo's not on the list because they just hate black fighters. No, if they didn't have someone like Errol Spence Jr. on the top 10 pound per pound list, that would be something that is highly debatable. But not having Jermell Charlo on the pound per pound list, that's not really something overall that you want to go there for, because there's a logical argument that he does not even belong in the top 10 pound per pound list to begin with. So once again, you have to be very careful overall with what you're alleging, because not what everyone says is meant to be hate. But anyway.
I understand it, and I myself talk about those things as well. But I also want to talk about the good, because it's like yin yang. There's two sides to the coin. And when it comes to a guy like Jermell Charlo, mans like Charlo is out here doing the damn thing. He's taking on these dangerous fights, and he's doing it
Well, he's taking quote-unquote dangerous fights. What his fights really remind me of is when Terrence Crawford is fighting against guys like Aegis Kavalaskas and Jose Benavidez. And then people like Dante and BOXINGEGO, because they like Terrence, they try to fatten his resume up overall, and they try to make it sound 10 times better than what it actually is. Or when Gervonta Tank Davis fights someone like a Mario Barrios or an Isaac Pitbull Cruz. Like, those guys are not going to be remembered as legitimate actual contenders. It just is what it is. Erickson Lupin is no better. Tony Harrison is not an elite fighter. Okay, when we talk about overall, who the hell was the other guy? Jason Rosario. Now, he did end up getting a knockout victory over Julian J-Rock Williams, but J-Rock Williams was always highly inconsistent. You can see that in several of his fights, and that's not me trying to give him an excuse. But Julian J-Rock Williams, unfortunately, for how greatly talented he was never really the same after the Jason Rosario knockout. I think that he took him way too lightly, And Jason Rosario is one of those fighters that ended up getting the upset win, I believe, because they caught the elite fighter that was either A, on an off night, or B, did not take them very seriously. That's what I like to call the Buster Douglas effect. Okay, that's what Jason Rosario was. Because Jason Rosario, I'm sorry, he is not an elite fighter. And if you don't believe me, check out overall how Jason Rosario looked against Erickson Lubin, and take a look overall how Erickson Lubin looked against Sebastian Fundura. And I don't even consider Sebastian Fundura an A-grade fighter. Okay? So it just is what it is.
Without a second.
Like I said, even if we were going to compare him to Josh Taylor was in a couple of fights against Regis Prograis and Jose Ramirez. Those are actually looked at as legitimate 50-50 fights. And Josh Taylor, in that fight going into those fights, was looked at as a decent A-grade champion. If you're looked at as a decent A-grade champion, and about 95 to 90% of the fights that you go into are not overall looked at as 50-50 fights, you don't have that great of a resume. And not every single fight that you have is always going to be a 50-50 fight. But if a fight, at least here and there, is not somewhat a 60-40 or along the lines of 70-30, you really ain't facing that great of competition. I'm sorry, it just is what it is.
Guess or a second thought is not no games. Like when it comes to Jermell Charlo, he's a true fighter. And he said this in his own interviews, but I'm saying it because Jermell Charlo, what more could you even respectfully ask from him as a fighter? Look at his run at 154.
Well, you can't really overall ask any more from him from 154, but I think that's what the problem is. I just don't think that there really is much at 154. I think that if Jermell Charlo is going to grace my top 5 pound-for-pound list, he's going to have to beat someone like a Terrence Crawford or an Errol Spence Jr. And to be quite honest with you, I don't know if I see him beating either of those fighters. If Terrence Crawford is able to get past Errol Spence Jr., I don't see him beating Terrence Crawford. Maybe he'd have more of a chance over Terrence, just because sometimes Terrence, he leaves his chin a little bit too wide open, and he can be hurt a little bit more than Errol Spence. If Errol Spence wins that fight, you might as well overall put up a tombstone or a gravestone for Jermell Charlo, because he's done. He's not beating Errol Spence.
Or from John Jackson, I was at that fight, to later Austin.
To be quite honest with you, and a lot of people may not agree with me on this, I think a prime Keith Thurman overall would give Jermell Charlo a hell of a run. Now, some people would say, well, listen, Keith Thurman, he just ain't, overall some bum. That's understandable. But if you're a person all in all that, is allegedly a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter, and if you're facing a fighter, unless they are so, debatably talented, someone like a Crawford or a Spence, when it comes down to it, and I think that you could still potentially lose to those guys, in my opinion, you're not a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. Because of Canelo Alvarez, if Jermell Charlo, let's say someone overall that was around his own same size or someone smaller than him, let's say that Jermell Charlo got in the ring with Canelo Alvarez, Canelo would absolutely pick apart Jermell Charlo. There would not even be a conversation. Now, of course, that's kind of shoulda, coulda, woulda. That's a little bit of a hypothetical, and we can't always go off of that. But listen, if you're intelligent enough and if you know enough about boxing, you know who has the goods and who does not have the goods. And I'm sorry, but at 154, who really is there that's elite? I'm sorry, it just is what it is.
Trout, veteran guys, to guys like...
Yeah, he beat Austin Trout, but he beat Austin Trout when he was pretty much completely done within his career. He was no longer an A-grade fighter. Austin Trout was an A-grade fighter for 3 fights in his career. He was an A-grade fighter for the Miguel Cotto fight. He was an A-grade fighter for the Canelo fight. And he was an A-grade fighter for the Araceli Lara fight. After those 3 ass whoopings, or excuse me, because they actually beat Miguel Cotto, but after the 2 losses that he overall received, once against Canelo and another one against Araceli Lara, he was never mentally the same fighter again after that. Never, ever, ever. But I just find that particularly interesting because BOXINGEGO allegedly will give credit to certain fighters, especially if they have a certain complexion, let's just be real, that he likes. He'll give them credit. But apparently Canelo Alvarez, he said that Jamal Charlo and Demetrius Andrade, that they should fight each other when it comes down to, or at least certain people have been saying that, and I've also been saying that as well, especially if one of them wants to get the fight, not saying that they don't deserve it against Canelo, but just saying that if you believe that Canelo is not interested, you should force him in the ring, potentially by facing or trying to face each other or get higher grade competition. Okay? Because that's what Devin Haney had to do against Jojo Diaz. That's what a certain amount of other fighters had to do to get their shots. That's what Errol Spence had to do overall and face Kell Brook. Those are what real fighters who are interested in title shots, in my view, do. Okay? Then that's not me saying that Certain fighters don't get the shit end of the stick, but there's too many fighters, in my opinion, that don't try enough overall to get big fights. All right, it is what it is. Or they claim that they want this big fight so bad, when in all reality, they just want the big A-grade fight against the cash cow, but they're not willing to face a lot of these other fighters. All right, and we'll talk about that later, because not every situation is the same. But, like I said, it's very particularly interesting because Ego will apparently tell you that Canelo overall, even if he does beat Jermell Charlo and Andrade, even if they have a loss, he's not beating fresh guys and all this other bullshit when it comes down to it. But apparently when it comes to Jermell Charlo, he's beating guys with multiple losses when it comes down to it usually. And apparently, he gives him full credit for that. So come on, what are we really talking about here? And that's how you know the difference between someone who is giving an actual logical judgment and someone who is a hater. When they overall have a certain high standards for this fighter, so unrealistically high that they can almost never live up to expectations, but then this next guy, overall, they don't hold them to the same standards at all. That's what a true hater is, okay? That's what a true hater is.
Jason Rosario coming off a career-defining performance where he knocked out Julian J-Rock Williams in Philly, where J-Rock had just looked sensational versus Hurd and had a dominant.
That is true, and I give Jason Rosario that, but Jason Rosario, and Ego knows this just as much as I do, Jason Rosario is no damn A-grade fighter. Never was, never will be. To be quite honest with you, I don't even think that he's a B-grade fighter.
Performance. So J-Rock looked exceptional versus
Jason Rosario would not even beat Tony Harrison, in my opinion, if both of them came in at their best.
Hurd to me. He hurt him, dropped him, things like that. And then to see J-Rock go into the Jason Rosario fight and get the hometown fight. So it's like boxing, sometimes you see the switching of hands like that, where lightweight, you see it. You see Lomachenko had the belts. Then he loses to Teofimo. Then Teofimo's first title defense, he loses to Kambosos. And then Kambosos' first title defense, he loses to Devin Haney. And
that is very true. There's a lot of divisions out there that have a switching of the guard. But just because a division has a big switching of the guard does not always mean that, in my view, that it is extraordinarily talented. Now 135 is one of those divisions that is extraordinarily talented. But just because a division overall has many, many switchings of the guards does not mean, all in all, that it is always extraordinarily talented. It could just be that of a weaker division. It just is what it is. Now, oftentimes, when there's a changing of the guard like that, it can be very, very decently competitive. But sometimes that really is a sign of one of the two. Either that division is very, very weak, or overall it's very, very decently strong.
More or less, that's kind of what we've seen at 154. You look at the 154 picture, you had Hurd.
Because if we were going to compare the talent pool at 135 and 154, it's really not even within the same galaxy. I mean, you're talking about Vasily Lomachenko, Gervonta Tank Davis, Devin Haney, Ryan Garcia, Teofimo Lopez, overall, George Kambosos, Isaac Pitbull Cruz, and I don't even consider him an A-grade fighter. You're talking about all those fighters. All those guys are somewhat of decent rough riders. And then at 154, who do you have there that really is A-grade? You have Jermell Charlo, and you used to have Brian Gastano, who's probably never going to be the same after that Jermell Charlo loss. But when it comes down to it all in all, other than those fighters, who really is there that's A-grade? Nobody. No one there is A-grade.
Was a champion, and he had a fight in D.C. He's from the DMV area, had a fight in D.C., and he got, embarrassed or beat decisively by J-Rock Williams, the visiting fighter, at home. So he was at home.
And Jarrett Hurd, even though he was a decent, athletic fighter, all Jarrett Hurd basically was the black version of Antonio Margarito. That's really all he was when it comes down to it. And if overall my opinion about that style, I'm not very big on that style. The Sebastian Fundura over Antonio Margarito type of style. And the reason why I don't like that style is because it's almost like a rushing quarterback in that of the NFL. So many people overall think that they're going to do or they're going to last for so long. But it's not going to last that very long because you're mainly only using your athleticism. And a lot of the times when they finally meet a team or, just like an NFL rushing quarterback, like that of a Cam Newton or a Colin Kaepernick, when they finally meet someone that all in all, knows how to somewhat, garner their weaknesses, or they know someone overall how to expose their weaknesses, all of a sudden they look very, very limited. And they're not usually going to be able to beat those extra strategic teams because they have a limited ability of throwing the ball downfield. It's the same thing with Lamar Jackson. It's the same thing with a certain amount of these rushing quarterbacks. It was the same thing overall with Jared Hurd, Antonio Margarito, and it's going to be the same thing for Sebastian Fundora. It's not that he's a bad fighter. It's not that those guys are bad fighters, but they have a very one-dimensional way of fighting.
He got beat by the visiting.
And if you're one-dimensional in any sport, I don't care who you are, eventually you're going to get beat. Even Deontay Wilder and George Foreman, two fighters all in all that were excellent powerhouses. Look eventually what the elite champions and the best champions of their day did to them. And Muhammad Ali really was not even at the best point in his career when he beat George Foreman. All right, but Muhammad Ali was smarter than him. He had more tools in his toolbox. He had more assets to fight with. It just is what it is. And then, of course, Tyson Fury, he did the same thing with Deontay Wilder.
And then he himself goes back home to Philly to put on his fight, and he loses by devastation, and he gets stopped. And this is the point in which Jermell Charlo is choosing to fight some of these opponents when they're lively and super dangerous. So you got no choice but to really respect it. You know,
Well, I mean, overall, there's certain guys that maybe you can argue that Jermell Charlo is fighting, at their best. He fought Brian Castano at his best twice, so I give him a lot of credit for that. I don't know if you would argue that he necessarily fought Tony Harrison at his best, but Tony was pretty much going to be the best that he ever was going to be. Tony is just never going to be an A-grade fighter, so I give him credit for that. But the problem is that a lot of these fighters, even at their best, they're nowhere near A-grade, at least in my opinion. Brian Castano, yes, A-grade fighter. All the other ones, no.
Respect the way he's...
Had he fought Austin Trout, I believe, at his prime, I probably would have called that an A-grade win. But Austin Trout, by the time that he fought him, he pretty much was done. Or he was nowhere near the same fighter.
Moving. You look at even Erickson Lubin, he was an undefeated guy, knocked out Jorge Cota, was styling on some guys, and looking very dangerous.
He knocked out Jorge Cota. Raise of hands. How many of you guys actually even know who the fuck Jorge Cota is? Like, come on. This is the same guy, all in all, that with Canelo Alvarez and Lomachenko, apparently he was facing guys that weren't all that great when it comes down to it, but we're going to give Erickson Lubin a parade because he beat Jorge Cota. You know who Jorge Cota is? Jorge Cota is a journeyman Mexican fighter, from what I remember, that gets knocked out in every elite fight in his career, and we're going to mention Jorge Cota. Like, come on, man. Who are you trying to fucking fool? Like, just stop.
It's dangerous southpaw. Charlo.
Like, that's like me trying to overall, if I were to try to bring up Terrence Crawford, or let's say I were to bring up Naoya Inoue when it comes down to, he beat Jamie McDonnell, and Jamie McDonnell, he beat this one very high grade, overall Japanese fighter. Like, dude, none of those fighters are A-grade fighters. It just is what it is. Anyway.
About one round. You look at the Hatley fight. Hatley fought Errol Spence in the amateurs, right? And Charles Hatley, there was this bad blood, both being from Texas. I was there, I was at the fight. He knocks him out. That's another dangerous mandatory. So now if he fights Tim Tszyu, it's more of the same. Another dangerous mandatory, and he's out there putting it all on the line.
Well, I give you credit all in all for facing the fighters that you have fought, but no, we can't call those fighters A-grade fighters. Tim Tszyu is not an A-grade fighter. Okay, he is not an A-grade fighter. he's just not. Tony Harrison is not an A-grade fighter. Erickson Lubin is not an A-grade fighter. Sebastian Fundora, I think, would be a very interesting fight, and that would be a big fight for Jermell Charlo. Debatably now, even the biggest fight there. But I don't see him as an A-grade fighter either. This is my opinion about certain fighters. And, of course, we can't do this with heavyweights because we don't really know what they would be like in other weight divisions. But in my opinion, if you're only a champion within one weight division, unless you completely unify that division, you're not an A-grade fighter. That's the way that I look at you. So when I see David Lemieux, someone all in all that, even though he was very decently athletically gifted, he's only held one belt in his life. He is never going to be an A-grade fighter. He is never going to win a belt in multiple weight divisions when it comes down to it. This is basically the way that I look at it. Even Paulie Malignaggi and Zab Judah, two fighters that have never even been debatable A-grade fighters within their life, even those fighters were able to win championships within a multitude of weight divisions. If Tony Harrison or Jason Rosario or overall any one of the fighters that Jermell Charlo has fought, even if they would have fought the version of Gennady Golovkin that we've seen in the last fight, Gennady Golovkin would tear them to shreds. Okay? It just is what it is.
I don't even have to talk about the Brian Castano fights because that's common sense. The Brian Castano fights. Castano had just beaten Texeria to become a champion. You could argue he beat Edislandi Lara when he fought him. You know, very crafty guy. And then Charlo.
Patrick Teixeira, bro, like really that's who we're gonna bring up. Like, come on. You know, it's so interesting because these guys always allege, once again, these are the same guys that like to allege that Canelo Alvarez, that allegedly that he's facing these weak European fighters. And all the points that I usually tried to make in my videos, I said, listen, Canelo Alvarez, he fought Caleb Plant, and he was coming off of victories overall over a Jose Uzcategui, who was able to knock out one of the Durrell brothers. Now, I don't think Durrell, in my opinion, was ever really a great fighter. But to beat someone like a Jose Uzcategui, who was able to knock him out and looked at as very decently dangerous at the time, and let's also be real, probably was on something. It just is what it is, because later on he got caught on PEDs. Caleb Plant was able to embarrass him. All right? So you have to know the difference between someone who, even though they may not be well known, someone who has the goods and someone who does not have the goods. Now, I'm not saying that Caleb Plant, in my opinion, was ever a top 10 pound-for-pound fighter. But at the end of the day, he was always looked at as very decently talented and decently skilled. Then all of a sudden, Canelo beats him, and what did they say? Oh, he's this weak European fighter. So, come on, what are we really talking about?
Fights him in a tough fight, scores a draw, and then that's not good enough, so he comes back.
But apparently Brian Castano is 100% A grade because he beat Patrick Teixeira and he beat Edislandi Lara when he was 35 years old. So, it is what it is. Or actually, he didn't even beat him. He had a draw. So, it is what it is. But anyway, and don't get me wrong. Once again, to be a logical and objective commentator, it doesn't matter what other people have to say. You have to, overall state the facts for what they are. Listen, Brian Castano, undoubtedly, in my opinion, was an A-grade fighter. So I give him a lot of credit for that. But all these other guys, nah.
Sets the record straight, no questions asked. He could have fought mandatories, he could have fought a tune-up, and, done what other fighters like Lomachenko and Canelo do. When Lomachenko has a close fight or a loss, he didn't...
Here we go. As you can tell, once again, ego does not like them. But anyway, but I will overall give him this point. Lomachenko overall could have rematched Teofimo Lopez. He did not rematch Teofimo Lopez, even though later on he did call for the rematch, but Teofimo Lopez declined. That's something that they don't mention, but it is what it is. Canelo Alvarez, of course, did not rematch Dimitri Bivol immediately when it comes down to it. But a lot of the other fights, Canelo Alvarez, all in all, he got the win. So one could maybe argue that he did not need to rematch that guy. The only fights, actually, if we really want to go there. Now, I won't, use this too much because I want to give credit where credit is due. I'll give Jermell Charlo credit for taking the, immediate rematches. But the only rematches that he's really taken were really overall against that of fighters that he either A, lost against, or it was a draw. So he pretty much had no choice. When he actually had a very tough fight against Vanes Martirosyan or over that of Austin Trout, he didn't take a rematch with those guys. So it is what it is. Now, one could say that was when he was on the way up, and maybe if you're a fighter that, is that young, you may not want a rematch with a fighter like that because, especially if you're from a coach's perspective, because you want them to build up. And some of those fights, especially early on in their career, they may be very hard fought tooth and nail.
Match them guys.
And the more you might be able to rematch them, the more likely it could be that your fighter loses. So if one wanted to make that point, they certainly could.
He didn't rematch Gary Russell Jr., and that was like a split decision win. He didn't rematch.
Oh, stop the bullshit. You got to really watch out once again with a lot of these channels because they will blatantly lie to you. That fight was not even close. People will literally dead ass look in your face when it comes down to it. Like I remember Aki TV's snake ass when it came down to when he was talking about Vasily Lomachenko one time. He was overall talking about his resume, trying to tear it down the whole entire time. And he was saying, like, yeah, he fought Nicholas Walters, but Walters was coming off of a draw. Dude, if you watch that fight, it was one of the biggest robberies of all time. And apparently, when it comes to one of the fighters that all of a sudden you know when to pull that information out of your ass. But when it comes to a fighter that you don't like, all of a sudden you don't want to put that information out there. So stop the bullshit. Like, who you kidding? That fight was not that close. It should have never been a split decision in the first place.
Teofimo, he still hasn't rematched Alito. Canelo didn't do an immediate rematch with Bivol, didn't do an immediate rematch with Mayweather, didn't do an immediate rematch with Lara. And look at Charlo, immediate rematch, set the record straight. And not only does he win.
Well, he did give him an immediate rematch, but one could argue that Jermell Charlo really did not have that much of a choice. All right? So it is what it is.
But he punctuates the win with a vicious knockout where he dropped Castano, I don't even think Castano had been dropped before, and he drops him twice and stops him.
That is a great win once again, and we do have to give Jermell Charlo credit. But once again, who really, who really overall, besides Brian Castano, there is a grade. I'm sorry, it just is what it is.
In a firefight, in a fight of the year, you know what I mean? So Jermell Charlo he's definitely Lions only, heart of a lion, and I respect it. And I think the world of boxing is doing a grave disservice to the Charlo brand by not putting him on the pound for pound list for whatever weirdo reason that old media won't put.
You apparently think they're doing Jermell Charlo a disservice, but I bet you money if it were Alexander Usyk or Tyson Fury or Vasily Lomachenko or any one of those fighters that were coming off of a big win, he wouldn't give a shit. It is what it is. Once again, my channel is all about this. I don't give a fuck who you are. I don't give a fuck what complexion you are. I don't care what people say. I'm an individual thinker. I don't go across any other media narrative when it comes down to it. I overall am not slaved by that mentality. Overall, I am an individual thinker. Whatever thought that I put out there when it comes down to it is going to be my own individual thoughts, and more than likely is going to have some sort of logic and rationale. Okay? Because every single one of my arguments, I usually have one to several arguments for, and that's what a logical and objective thinker does. When they overall put facts on the table, they'll usually bring up several points that actually make sense and are in the proper context. Anyway.
Charlo on the pound for pound top 10 list. I mean, it's insane. It's crazy. But this is...
no, it's not really insane and crazy. A fighter that would be insane not to put on the pound for pound list would be someone over like an Errol Spence Jr. and maybe a Terrence Bud Crawford. That would be a fighter, or those would be a pair of fighters that would be insane not to put on the pound for pound list. Jermell Charlo, in my opinion, yes, he's undisputed. But for those of us that are contextual thinkers, for those of us that, overall, see through a certain amount of the things, and don't get me wrong, that's not me trying to say that, people are trying to play a game and they're promoting a narrative. Jermell just doesn't deserve to be on there. Listen, in my opinion, he's not on there. But if you were to put him on there, I don't really have a problem with that. But to say that it's crazy, that it's insane, it's not really that insane at all. Now, are there certain fighters, for example, on the ESPN list or certain lists that that are on that list that I would not put above them? Yeah, sure. Like, for example, I would not have Vasily Lomachenko right now above Jermell Charlo, even though I do think he's clearly the more skilled fighter and he probably has the better resume. But at the end of the day, Vasily Lomachenko has no belts. And the last big A-grade win that you had in your career, you lost. Just period, point blank. Just is what it is. So I can't have him on the pound for pound list. But if we're comparing them, once again, I already told you my 5 fighters that I clearly have over him. Errol Spence, Terrence Crawford, Tyson Fury, Alexander Usyk, and Canelo Alvarez. Canelo Alvarez. Those are the 5 fighters that I clearly have above him. All right, now once again, let's go on the bottom 5. You could debate Naoya Inoue over him if you wanted to. You could debate Josh Taylor over him if you wanted to. You could debate Dimitri Bivol over him if you wanted to. You could debate Devin Haney and Shakur Stevenson over him if you wanted to. And even if you wanted to add someone like an Artur Beterbiev, you could add him to the list if you really wanted to. Because truth be told, Artur Beterbiev is 1 belt away from unifying a somewhat decently talented weight division. And on top of that, Artur Beterbiev overall is debatably the most dominant fighter in the world. At least debatably. He's never lost when it comes down to it. And on top of that, Artur Beterbiev, that win that he has over Gvozdyk, that is a true A-grade fighter. Now, if you don't have to say that he was necessarily A+, but you do have to say that he was at least on the A to A- tier, probably A-, but at the end of the day, still a very great win. Gvozdyk, for those of you that don't know, knocked out Adonis Stevenson when he was a little bit older and still was defending that WBC belt overall. And then he went in the fight against Artur Beterbiev, and Artur Beterbiev absolutely crumbled him.
Boxing world we live.
Even though the fight was somewhat competitive.
So shout out to Charlo, definitely a fan, and you just got to respect the way he's moving.
Well, that's the problem, is that you're a fan in the first place. And this is what I say on my channel. When you're a logical and objective thinker, you're not supposed to be a fan in the first place, or at least a very big fan, because really, in my opinion, you're not supposed to be a fan in general, because that ruins your logic and objectivity. And it puts you in a very emotional state to where it's really going to block you, or it's really overall going to keep you from, keeping you in that logical state of mind, ranking things logically and objectively.
And keep in mind, this is all in a stacked division. It's not like some of these divisions.
No, it is not in a stacked division. It is not in a stacked division. People keep on saying this. No, it is not in a stacked division. Tim Tszyu is not an A-grade fighter. Okay, he is not an A-grade fighter. Once again, if you were to put any of the undefeated fighters up at 160 pounds right now, Tim Tszyu, Sebastian Fundora, take a prime Erickson Lubin, if you were to take, all in all, Tony Harrison, even Julian J. Rock Williams, if you were to even put them up against the 40-year-old Golovkin that we have today, that in my opinion is pretty much at least 70 to 60% of what he was, Gennady Golovkin would tear through those guys. So no, I'm sorry, that is not a stacked weight division. The Brian Castano win was a decent A-grade win. No one else in that division is decently stacked. No, I'm sorry.
Cruiserweight's kind of light. There's not that many standout fights you could have. He's at 54.
Now, why did he mention cruiserweight? Now, maybe he's just talking about it at the current moment in time, but notice that these guys tend to talk about cruiserweight as an alleged weak division, especially when it comes to Mr. Alexander Usyk. Isn't that very particularly interesting? Anyway.
Which is one of the most stacked in the world. So, big respect to the way...
No, 154 is not one of the most stacked weight divisions in the world. In fact, it's probably one of the bottom 5 divisions, at least debatably, in any division that we regularly talk about. Now, don't get me wrong, that is not Jermell Charlo's fault, but at the end of the day, it does have to be realized.
Like I said, the way he's moving to the Tim Tszyu or whatever, that fight, it could be dangerous.
That division is so stacked that you even know how to pronounce Tim Tszyu's name correctly. Okay.
Tszyu saying he wants it, has some power, has a legendary father who probably gives him advice, beat Terrell Goucher, a U.S. Olympian. You know what I mean? Let's go.
Beat Terrell Goucher. Once again, Eagle, you're doing a very, very good job promoting Jermell Charlo as a debatable top 5, top 10 pound-for-pound candidate. But let's be real, for those of us that actually know what we're talking about, or overall for those of us that know the history, know shit about boxing, Tim Tszyu is no damn A-grade fighter. Like, you're mentioning that he beat Terrell Goucher, an alleged U.S. Olympian. Not every U.S. Olympian ends up being shit. It just is what it is. Anyway.
With it. So, Charlo...
Like, take a look at Luke Campbell. That's like me saying, all in all, that Ryan Garcia, that he beat Luke Campbell, because that's pretty much what Terrell Goucher is. He's pretty much another Luke Campbell. He's pretty much another fighter that is never going to win a belt. He's going to be a C-grade fighter for the rest of his life. Does he have certain skills? Yes, he does, but he's always going to be a gatekeeper. Okay, he's going to give tough fights, to maybe elite fighters or decent fighters here and there, but he is never going to be an A-grade fighter. That's like me saying Ryan Garcia, well, you got to give him credit because he beat Luke Campbell, and Luke Campbell's an Olympian. Boxing Ego would never say that. Anyway.
With the smoke. Let me know how I did. SLC, subscribe, like, and comment.
But anyways, that's really about it for the video. But I thought that the video was very particularly interesting because I thought that we would talk about that debate. But that's really about it for today. As for Mr. Jermell Charlo, the next apparent fight that he is going to be a part of is apparently going to be against Tim Tszyu. And I'm going to be very interested to see overall what ends up happening in that fight. But, well, I shouldn't say very interested. I'm just going to say overall I watched the fight, but I don't really expect much from Tim Tszyu. Because I don't think that Tim Tszyu is really an A-grade fighter. Now, I could be wrong, but I highly doubt it. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see what Mr. Jermell Charlo does. I don't think that we're really going to see him highly challenged unless he gets in the ring with either a Terrence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr., or perhaps someone who's very, very talented at 147. That does not mean that he necessarily has to take those fights right now, but in my opinion, if he is going to grace my top 5 pound-for-pound, he is going to have to be there. Because really, in my opinion, there really is no debate for Jermell Charlo being a top 5 pound-for-pound fighter. I don't even have him really within my top 10. And top 5, no, I'm sorry. There's really no argument for that. Not in my view. But it just is what it is. Anyways, that's really about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.